Trevor Jackson.
Hello, Emily Holler.
Nice to have you here today.
It's lovely to be here.
I know you from your previous role. For many years, you were the music and content director of ABC Gold Coast. But I'm interested in what other experience you've had in the industry, or is there some little fun fact you want to share?
Look, I've always been passionate about music. That's what drew me to radio in the first place. And primarily commercial radio. I started out as a presenter on commercial radio, but I'm also a journalist. So when I became disenchanted with commercial radio and I joined the ABC, that journalism background really helped me there. But I've been a music director for both commercial radio and the ABC. Virtually every role in my career has had some sort of music bent to it, just about. I've done everything from music journalism to being a club DJ back in the day. Yeah. So really, it's just the love of music that's driven those choices.
And I'll tell you what, you really do have a great radio voice.
Yeah, and a great radio head, which is why I shouldn't be on camera right now. I think that's the mileage. I think, if you punish your voice for long enough and you live a bad lifestyle, anything is possible.
Well, it's working for you, my friend. Let me say that. So look, I've invited you here today to talk about mainstream radio. Obviously, this is for an indie artist audience. And I think a lot of indie artists are kind of a bit mystified by the whole mainstream radio beast. So I'm interested in something you told me once, actually, a story about how mainstream radio used to operate many years ago, and it was very different to how it is now.
Yeah, true. Look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, for instance, that, back in the good old days on commercial radio, we all had freedom to play whatever we want, because it just didn't happen. It's not true. Music formats and restrictive playlists have been around since Bill Haley first rocked around the clock. But there was a time back in the 1980s when commercial FM first started, when there was a very bold, adventurous kind of thinking behind what was happening on commercial radio. And that's because for so long, people were just fed a diet of hits on top 40 radio on AM. So when FM came along and it just sounded so much better, all of these music heads were suddenly going, great, we can play whatever we want. So you were getting deep album cuts, you were getting songs that weren't hit records, but you're also getting independent artists, you were getting unsigned artists, you were getting unknown artists. It was, and a lot of Australian music too. See, prior to the 1980s, AM radio didn't play a lot of Australian music, really.
Wow.
So you were getting a lot of artists that suddenly boomed through that whole 80s period, and those great pub rock bands like Midnight Oil and Cold Chisel, et cetera, Hoodoo Gurus, whatever, suddenly started getting profile, and a lot of that was because they were getting played on commercial FM. You think of Cold Chisel now and you think, oh, well, they're a commercial band, but AM radio wouldn't touch them. It wasn't until FM came along that they were prepared to embrace this, bluesy bar band that had really bad boy attitude. You think about it, and that's where that came from. So it was very different, very, very different beast to what it is today, FM. And so if you're trying to compare what FM was in the 80s, and this lasted for a good decade or so or more, to what it is now, they're like different planets. So it's probably hard, if you've just grown up and listened to commercial FM radio now, you couldn't conceive of how different it was then.
Wow. But
it was very bold, very adventurous, very different, and they took risks, really big risks.
Yeah, because look, today it seems like commercial radio, for an indie artist perspective, commercial radio is, pretty much impossible to crack without either a huge marketing budget, record label support, or some kind of massive viral following. Why is that? Why has it changed? How has it changed?
Well, there's a lot of reasons why. Number one, I guess it changed because money became everything. Money and ratings became everything. The people who were passionate about music, and it wasn't just the presenters, it was the programmers, it was the managers, the sales staff, they were all into it. It changed because it just became so successful. It became a victim of its own success, and it was all about money. Big amounts were paid for commercial FM licenses, and so it changed from what started out as a relatively cheap cottage industry that supported everyone, much like small music acts, same sort of thing, became a very big commercial enterprise. So it's a very different beast.
Entity.
Yeah, very much, and the people who were making the decisions were bean counters. They weren't music lovers,
Got you.
So very different mindset. But I can give you examples just to sort of illustrate how different it was, if I think about, like, if I go back to the early 90s, I'm working at Triple M Sydney, which is the #1 station, which had a massive audience and yet was taking a lot of risks with what it was playing. There were bands that were unknown at that time, like, for instance, let's pick Australian bands like Skunk Hour or Powderfinger, for instance. And we were supporting those bands and playing them. And they weren't just like one-off plays in some late night time slot. This was getting played across the day on a station. Both of those bands went on to have very successful careers. Powderfinger, of course, became enormous. But, if I think about, there was a song off their second EP called Transfusion. That was the name of the EP. The song was called Reap What You Sow. We were playing that, for instance. Now, that came out before they even released their debut album, which was Stiffed, that no one bought. So it was well before they had any kind of commercial success, and yet we were supporting that. Yet, if a song like that came out today, there's no way that commercial FM or any commercial radio would really play it.
It's a very different pathway now, isn't it? It really is.
It is, yeah. It's changed. So what's happened is that independent bands don't have that avenue anymore to get that kind of support that they used to once get.
Yeah, true. And so, I mean, does like an ABC, obviously you worked for ABC for many years, is that more accessible to an indie artist?
Oh yeah, I mean, look, the obvious answer is Triple J. Everyone knows about Triple J, and it's fantastic, of course, because they support unsigned, independent, unknown acts. It's great.
And the Unearthed platform can
Of
sort of bring them
course, I
through.
mean, they're always broadening it. The only problem with it is that if you're an unsigned or an unknown independent act, you're competing against every other unsigned, unknown, independent act in the country trying to get Triple J's attention. And it's tough.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And so what would you say to an indie artist about how to approach it then? What would be the way to what would be the best pathway through that?
Sure. Well, look, by all means, go for it. If you can get airplay on Triple J, it's great. But if that's the only trick in your book, if that's the one shot you've got, then the law of averages are against you. You're really going to have to think about other ways to do it. I can think about, for instance, as a music director on the Gold Coast, an artist like Amy Shark, for instance, who struggled for years under various names. She operated under different names before she became known as Amy Shark. And, I supported her. We were playing her music. But she got a groundswell, local press. She got airplay, obviously, through us and other stations. Community stations, obviously, are a great way to go. So there are other avenues to get that. In Amy's case, it started to come to a head when she began being recognised in the Queensland Music Awards. So music awards are always good too. I know some artists can sort of poo-poo the idea of, music awards, it's just, what's the point? But there's a really big point, because if you're getting that recognition, you can go to, even if it's a community station or a local ABC radio station, and say, look, I just won the blah, blah, blah music award for this song. Will you give it a listen? At the very least, they'll probably play it and say, for the very reason that it's won that award, whether they like it or not, just to signify the fact that it's a news story.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's also a good thing to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned community radio there. Do you think community radio is a viable option? I know that they, artists can sponsor community radio, pay for ads, and they do support independent artists. Would you suggest that that's a good viable option as well?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's some great community radio stations around the country, and you've got the Triple Zs and the Triple Rs. There's another great community station in Melbourne called PBS, has a very broad playlist. Definitely, but I think you need to also think about what kind of music you're creating and the radio station you're targeting. And that doesn't go for just community radio, that goes for any kind of radio station. For instance, on the Gold Coast, Radio Metro is great if you're a dance act or if you're, an electronica act. But, if you're playing some sort of, thrashy indie retro punk, that might not be the avenue for you to get airplay. So you're going to have to think about somewhere else. But, find your mark. If you as a musician, you're listening to a radio station and you can hear the kind of music or something similar to what might be where you're going, then that's always a good start. Or maybe it's a presenter. Maybe there's a particular presenter that you think is really intelligent, that's passionate about music, that gets it, and you think, if I target that presenter and send them my song, then, you know, I might be able to get them to play the song.
Thank you. That's great information. So I guess, you know, in terms of summarising what we've talked about just now, this whole point of, you know, the lowdown on mainstream radio, is it something about like starting local and growing from there, or how would you summarise everything that we just said?
Yes, definitely. I mean, look, it's the best place to start. Even if Triple J is your end goal, or Spotify, or whatever it might be, build from the ground up. You know, utilize all your friends, their social networks, get them to share the love. I mean, it's common sense, and I'm sure all artists would do this, but if it's not, then definitely do that. Create a vibe, you know. Send your records to the local street press. See if they'll review it for you, you know. See if they'll get someone to come and review one of your gigs. Do whatever you can to get your name out there, to be noticed. And that doesn't mean you have to be outrageous. Just be really good at what you do. Yeah. Be really professional about it. Don't think, oh, that's all too hard. You've got to really want it, and you've got to work for it harder than ever before, because there's so few options. I mean, you've got the internet, which is great, but again, like the Triple J option, you're competing against everybody else out there that's trying to get their music heard on the web.
So true, so true. Excellent. Well, look, I'm going to throw a little kind of curveball question at you now. If you were stuck on a desert island for the rest of your life, and you could only take one album with you, what would it be?
Oh, jeez. All right, I'm going to show my age a bit here, and I didn't know you were going to ask this. That's really unfair.
I know, sorry.
Here's my rationale for choosing it. I'm a massive Paul Kelly fan, and I still think he's making great music, which is just phenomenal. He is Australia's bard of music, or troubadour. And if I had to choose an album of his, it is my favourite, but it's also the fact that it's a double album that means that I get twice as many songs to take with me. So it'd be Gossip, which I still love to bits and I still listen to often. I love that record. Look, there's many that I could choose, but
it's a very hard choice, and thank you for answering that so well when I threw it at you, just cruelly, blatantly, evilly like that. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here, Trevor. It's such a pleasure to hear all your wisdom, and thanks for sharing.
Pleasure.